welcome home. If you're joining us online on King's Community Live or Facebook Live, we welcome you tonight. And I believe we have a group from Revive, or One for Israel. Or yes? Welcome to you tonight. Thank you for being with us. Just want to cover two things real quick before we get into the message tonight. Number one, youth, you guys can be released and go to the gathering for Esco Bistro in the T&R room. It wasn't in the announcements, but you guys can go ahead and be released and head on over for that gathering. And secondly, I just want to make note of something. As you saw about our giving, we've made some changes in the past few weeks, and you may have noticed that we don't have a portion of the service that's designated for receiving tithes and offerings, but we want you to know that the ushers are available at the end of the service. They'll be at the doors. They'll have baskets to receive any offerings, tithes that you have, or gifts that you have as you depart from the service tonight. And also, you can always give at any time. On the giving boxes in the wall, there's one there at the back of the auditorium. There's one in the pavilion lobby area. And there's also, you can give at the website, kkcj.org/donations, and you'll see how you can give online. But again, welcome. We're glad that you're with us. We're going to continue on tonight in our series, What a Father Sees, from Genesis chapter 49. And if you're just joining us in this series, if you're just joining us for the first time tonight, this is a portion of passage where Jacob, before he dies, speaks blessings upon his 12 sons. And Pastor Chad began the series 2 weeks ago with the blessings that Jacob spoke over Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, his first three sons with Leah. And in that message, he shared with us a few things. I just want to touch them quickly. He shared us with it. We have to understand what a blessing from the Father truly is. He said that a blessing from the Father is not always kind words of affirmation. He said sometimes a father's blessing can be words that we need to hear, words that can encourage us to grow and leave our sin and our past behind us. So, and that'll play into our topic tonight, but that was one of the key points he made. And then he said, we must always remember that without question, God's desire is to bless us. He said that God was looking for Abraham. When can I bless him? God was excited about blessing Abraham and his children, and God is excited about the opportunity to bless us. We have to keep that in mind. And then last week, Pastor Mike continued in the series, and he talked to us about the blessing that was given to Judah. He talked about how this particular blessing to Judah foreshadowed the promised Messiah, and how Judah's family line, that the Messiah would come through Judah's family line, and he said to Judah specifically that the scepter would not depart from Judah or from his family. And Pastor Mike also showed us from that passage that God's ways are not always our way. God didn't go the birthright route of who was next in line, but God went a different way with Judah. And Pastor Mike encouraged us that sometimes the best response when we're challenged with that truth, that God's way is a little different than what we expect or what we desire, that it's our best response is simply to praise him and to walk with him in obedience and praise and to worship him. So tonight we're going to continue on. If you have your Bibles, we're going to look at Genesis 49, but so you can go ahead and turn there. But I want to give you a little background for our text first before I get to that. And I want to paint a picture, because as I was studying this passage over the last week, I realized in myself, I had a picture in my mind at this point in time, and the scripture's pretty clear, but I still had this picture in my mind of where Jacob and his sons were at the time of Jacob giving these blessings. So I just want to back up a little bit and just give us paint a picture of what's happening, where they are today. So we know that before Jacob and his sons leave Canaan, because Joseph calls them to come to Egypt, we know that they have possessions. And in Genesis 46:6, it tells us that they took these possessions, livestock and goods, and all that they had gained in the land of Canaan, that he took them down with them to Egypt. And by the time we get to this passage in Genesis 49, Jacob and his sons have been living in Egypt, in the land of Goshen, for 17 years. It's a long time, 17 years. And we know that by Genesis chapter 47, verse 28. It gives the lifespan of Jacob, and it says that they lived in the land of Goshen for 17 years. So by this point in time, Jacob and his sons, by the time we get to this passage in Genesis 49, they're doing very well. Okay? If you remember the story, Joseph presents his father and his brothers to Pharaoh, and he says, hey, to his brothers, tell him that you're herdsmen, what he asks. And so in saying that, Pharaoh says to Joseph, if there's any capable men among your brother or among the men with them, put them over my livestock. So probably at the outset, they not only had what they brought with them, but they took on some of what Pharaoh had. And in this period of 17 years, Joseph begins to amass things on behalf of Pharaoh. If you remember the story, the famine continues, and the people come to Joseph and they say, look, we don't have any money left. We can't buy food with money. Take our animals. So they trade their animals to Joseph, and he gives them food. And that runs out. And they come back to him and they say, well, we don't have any animals, but we have land. Take our land. It's yours. Just give us food. And that runs out. And they say, well, look, we don't have anything left but us. So we're your slaves forever. Just give us food. And Joseph cares for the people, but he acquires a massive amount of possessions and wealth on behalf of Pharaoh. And I have to assume that some of this is being looked over by his family members. So let's get that picture in our head where they're at when this time comes that Jacob is calling his sons to himself to bless them. Second thing I want to point out, just kind of before we get to the passage, is that this passage in Genesis 49 is written as Hebrew poetry. And I wondered the question, why? Why is that the case? Why is Jacob speaking in a poetic form here? And I'll tell you what I believe is the reason. I believe in that culture, in that time, this is how they passed very important information down from generation to generation. They put it in a form that was transferable. It was memorable. It was repeatable. They put things in a way that could be said and repeated and passed down. And that is the reason why this is presented in a poetic fashion, because Jacob believes this is important and it needs to be passed down. But it also tells me that Jacob took time to think about what he was about to say to his sons. This wasn't his dying breath and, okay, let me see, what do I have? He took time to process these words and to think about what he was going to say to his sons. And he knew that it was important and it needed to be passed down. So with that as some background, let's look at our passage of Scripture tonight. And this is in Genesis chapter 49, and we're going to begin in verse 13. Verse 13, Zebulun will live by the seashore and will be a harbor for ships, and his territory will be next to Sidon. Verse 14, Issachar is a strong donkey lying down between the saddlebags. He saw that his resting place was good and that the land was pleasant, so he leaned his shoulder to bear a load and became a forced laborer. Father, tonight we thank you for your word. We thank you that it gives us illumination, and we pray tonight that it would illuminate our hearts and minds as we glean from it. As you gave these words to your servant Jacob, God, would it also inspire and provide insights to us tonight? And we ask it in the name of Yeshua. Amen. So I titled tonight's sermon in our series title, What a Father Sees, and I put differences. What a father sees sometimes is differences. Because I believe what Jacob saw and these two brothers that we're going to talk about tonight, being Zebulun and Issachar, was differences. And there's some reasons for that. We'll look at it here more in depth. But these two young men, or at this time probably men with families, were in contrast to one another. And I believe that's why they're grouped together. As anyone with children knows, each child is different, right? No two children are the same. They are different as sometimes night and day. And in the case of Zebulun and Issachar, they seem to be quite different. In fact, again, I believe they're grouped in this passage, and we'll look at another passage as well. They're grouped together, I believe, because they actually stand in contrast to one another. And that's one of the things that Jacob is trying to bring light to, is there's a contrast between these two sons. So let's look at this contrast a little bit, but let's get a little background on these two sons of Jacob. We're going to go in birth order, so we're going to flip it. Because actually in this passage, the birth order is reversed. Because Zebulun is the youngest brother of Issachar. So Jacob actually reverses even their birth order in his blessing. But we're going to flip it back, and we're going to look at Issachar. He was the 9th son of Jacob, the 5th born by Leah. And his name plays on the Hebrew word meaning to hire. And if we look at Genesis chapter 30, verse 17, this is the story of Leah and her birth. And it says in verse 17 of chapter 30, "And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a 5th son. And Leah said, 'God has given me my wages because I gave my servant to my husband.' So she called his name Issachar. 'God has given me my hire because I gave my servant to my husband.'" But then just before that passage in verse 14, there's a story where Leah's oldest son Reuben finds some mandrakes in the field while he's at the wheat harvest. And her sister Rachel wants some of the mandrakes, and she comes to her and says, "Will you give me some of those mandrakes?" And she said, "What? You took my husband, you want to take my son's mandrakes too?" And she said, "Well, here, you can give me your mandrakes. You can have Jacob tonight. It's my night. So you can hire him for the evening. He's yours." And I think that's where we get this meaning into Issachar's name of to be hired. Now, Jacob's words in his blessing, we're going to specifically look at this portion that he talks to Issachar. In verse 14 and 15, he says this again. "Issachar is a strong donkey lying down between the saddlebags. He saw that his resting place was good and that the land was pleasant, so he leaned his shoulder to bear a load and became a forced laborer." Now, for me, these words indicate to me that Issachar is someone that is happy to settle and enjoy the land. He can be content. The land is plentiful. It's good. I'm just plant myself here. This is good. I like life. I enjoy the fruits of the land. I enjoy that I have my family around me. He's happy. He's content. He will do whatever is needed to remain where he is, even if that means paying tribute to a ruler or being forced into labor. Here, just take what you want. Just leave me alone. Okay? I'll give you some tribute. Just let me enjoy my land. Leave me alone. I'm okay. He's happy. He's contented in that. Now, my youngest son, Jacob, he's 3. I see a little bit of this kind of attitude in him. He can go off in our playroom where we have the children's toys, and he'll just lay down by himself with a truck, and he'll be in there playing, and he's content. He's happy. Leave him alone. If one of his older siblings comes into the room and gets into his business, leave me alone. Just get out of my way. He's contented in where his place is. He can be content in that. He finds contentment rather easy. I see that characteristic. And maybe you have a sibling like this. Maybe you're like this. You can find, and I think this is part of the character of who Issachar is. Now let's look at Zebulun. Again, Zebulun was the 10th son of Jacob. He was the 6th born to him by Leah. And Zebulun's name is probably derived from the Hebrew word meaning to exalt or honor. And let's look at his birth story as accounted in Genesis 30, verse 19 and 20. "And Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a 6th son. And then Leah said, 'God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will honor me because I have borne him 6 sons.' So she called his name Zebulun." So she gives a name that now my husband, because I've given him 6 sons, he'll honor me, he'll exalt me. This is kind of the root of where his name comes from. And then Jacob, in his blessing to Zebulun in verse 13 of chapter 49, says, "Zebulun will live by the seashore and will be a harbor for ships, and his territory will be next to Sidon." Now, the easy takeaway from this is that, okay, this is where he'll dwell. This is where his future will be, where his dwelling is. But what I took away from this is this doesn't just relate to his dwelling. This relates to his person. Zebulun is an inquisitive person, not someone to stay and be content where he is. The opposite of his brother. Zebulun wants to go and explore and see the world and get knowledge and understand things. Zebulun is an inquisitive mind. He's maybe the ADD child. That's a label. I need to do something. I just can't be here. He's that kind of child. My oldest son, Kenton, is a little bit like this. He needs to explore something. Dad, can we go check this out? Dad, he's just that way. He has that kind of inquisitive nature in him. He wants to learn something. He wants to do something. He sometimes doesn't sit still for a real long time. Again, there's that nature in him. So we see, again, a contrast in these two brothers. And if you think that I'm just drawing things out here, let's look at Moses, actually, gives us some insight into these same two families. If we look at the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 32, actually, we're going to read from chapter 33, but in chapter 32, Moses is told by God that he would be passing on, that he would be gathered up to his people, or he would be dying, and he needed to go to this mountain. But before Moses dies, like Jacob, Moses pronounces a series of blessings on the tribes of Israel. Did you know that? And this gives us a little insight. I want to look, it says this in verse 1 of chapter 33 of Deuteronomy. This is the blessing that Moses, the man of God, gave the Israelites before his death. And if we scoot on down to verse 18 of chapter 33, he said this about Zebulun: "Rejoice, Zebulun, in your journeys, and Issachar in your tents. They summon the peoples to a mountain, and they offer acceptable sacrifices, for they draw from the wealth of the seas and the hidden treasures of the sand." I think here again we see these two characters brought out. Issachar, rejoice in your travels. You're going to go. You're going to go do things. You're going to explore. You're going to do things. Or Zebulun, sorry. Issachar, rejoice in your tents. You are going to be happy in your dwelling. This is the character and the contrast that we see here. And I just want to use a story to kind of illustrate this for me, because this made so much sense to me after reading this. I want you to imagine it's a beautiful day in the wilderness. Two young brothers, Zebulun and Issachar, are out watching their father Jacob's flocks in the wilderness. Again, it's lovely, it's a cool breeze, and they're there, and Issachar sees a tree and says, "Man, I'm going to go plant myself down by that tree, and I'm going to sit here and just enjoy the sun and enjoy the day and just enjoy today, because this is a good place. It's a nice day." And his brother Zebulun comes up and says, "Hey, Issachar, there's a cave over there. Let's go check it out. Come on, let's go check this out." And his brother's like, "Man, I'm not going to explore no cave. It's a nice day. I've got a tree with some shade. I'm going to sit here and just enjoy this day and watch the sheep. You do what you want, man, but I'm going to stay here." And his little brother just keeps getting agitated. Come on. And he's kicking rocks. "Come on. Just going to sit here all day and sit under this tree? You're so boring. Come on. Let's go do something." And it just continues to agitate. Anybody have siblings like this? Yeah, anyway. just continues to get at it. Come on. And this is the contrast of these two brothers that we see. I think this was their interaction with one another. And I think finally, true to his character, Issachar would say, "Hey, okay, listen. Mom baked me this really nice cake, and if you will be quiet and just go over there and sit down and leave me alone, I'll give you some of this cake. Just leave me alone and go over there and just sit down." And again, we see this character played out in that idea. So I had to ask myself, what was Jacob trying to convey in his words to these two brothers? What is he trying? Was it merely just, this is who you are, or this is where you dwell? What was he trying to get across to them? And I believe Jacob saw something that needed to be valued and understood by these two brothers. And that's why they're grouped together. It's interesting, if you look even at the blessing that Moses gives, they're grouped together. And in fact, every other tribe, it says, "And he said to Gad, and he said to Asher, and he said to Joseph." But Zebulun and Issachar, it just says, "And he said to Zebulun," and they're grouped together as if they're one. And again, I believe that's intentional because they're grouped to be intentionally shown as a contrast to one another. And I believe Jacob saw that these two brothers needed to understand their differences. Why? What's at stake? Why do they need to understand this? They need to understand their differences because what's at stake is their relationship with one another. Because of their differences, they are inclined to clash. They are inclined to fight. They are inclined to aggravate one another. And they needed to understand their differences in one another and realize who they were and realize that they're different. They were both sons of Leah. They were probably close enough in age that, again, this was really, really problematic when they were young. But this was probably a daily thing. And I think Jacob saw this. He saw this in who they were. And I think his words were such an incredible insight. He understood his sons. He had such incredible insight into who they were, and he believed they needed to understand that for themselves. The words that Jacob speaks are not a condemnation to his sons. I believe they're a recognition and an attempt to help them understand themselves. I believe Jacob believed that God's promises were true. So he wasn't speaking in fear that, well, God doesn't have anything for my family. God had promised Jacob and his forefathers that their descendants would be like the seashore. So I know that he believed that God would be faithful to his promise to all of his children. So I don't believe he's speaking in fear. I believe he's speaking insight, wisdom. So the question we come to tonight is, what do we do with this? What do we process in this? You know, you could say, thank you, Pastor Ray. You've pointed out a contrast. Wonderful. Great. What do we do with this? How do we apply this? We need to understand, just like Jacob felt like it was necessary for these two sons, we need to understand who we are. If we don't have a good understanding of who we are, our strengths, our weaknesses, we run the risk of a few things. We run the risk of trying to be or become something that we were not intended to be. If we don't understand who we are, we run the risk of trying to be or become something that God didn't intend for us to be. And we're going to look at this a little bit more here in a second because I want to expand on that. If we don't have an understanding of who we are, we run the risk of trying to make everyone else like us. And if we don't understand who we are, we run the risk of denying someone else their purpose or function in the community or in the family of God. The Apostle Paul, when he writes to the people at Corinth in his first letter to them, he says in the opening parts of the letter, it's actually recorded in chapter 4, he says, I'm writing to them as a father, not to shame them, but to warn them. I have insights I need to share with you, not as a father, but because you need to understand some things. And then he begins to just deal with a bunch of things that cause division in the body. And he starts to go through a lot of different things that are possible causes or causes of division in the body. But then in chapter 12, he proceeds to go into this discussion, and he uses a beautiful illustration of the human body. And you're familiar with this passage, I'm sure, but he uses a beautiful imagery of the human body to address how we are different and how we should respond to this truth of how differences can affect us in the body. So I want to look at this real quick in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. If you'll turn there, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, beginning in verse 12. And this is what he says. For as the body is one and has many parts, and all the parts of that body, though many, are one body, so also is the Messiah. For we were all baptized by one Spirit into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and we were all made to drink of one Spirit. So the body is not one part, but many. We have come from different backgrounds. Some were slaves, some were free. We have come from different cultures. We have come from different upbringings. But in the person of the Messiah, we are brought together as one. Verse 15, if the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I don't belong to the body. In spite of this, it still belongs to the body. And if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I don't belong to the body, in spite of this, it still belongs to the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But now God has placed each one of the parts in one body just as he wanted. And if they were all the same part, where would the body be? How many times do people say, well, I'm not the pastor, so I'm not. Or I'm not this, or I'm not that. And discredited themselves from a part of being involved in God's work or part of the body because they were not something they thought they should have been. We have to understand and we need to appreciate that God made us specifically, just as he made Zebulun and Issachar specifically different. God made us differently to serve a function in the body. Each part is necessary and belongs to the body. If I have a nose so I can smell sometimes, if I'm not congested. I have ears so I can hear. I have eyes that I can see. I have hands that I can grasp things. I have feet that can take me. I am so much more capable as a human being because I have all of these senses and functions working together. When I have not one of them, I become limited. God designed us that way in our bodies, and he designed us that way collectively as his body. And we need to understand that. Now there are many parts, this is verse 20, yet one body. So the eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you. Or again, the head can't say to the feet, I don't need you. But even more, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are necessary. We need one another. Jacob understood that Zebulun and Issachar needed one another and vice versa. They needed each other. You guys need each other. And even though Issachar probably would have been seen as the weaker because he was passive, Zebulun needed him. And let me give you context. I have a strong feeling that somewhere in their childhood, Zebulun was saved from extreme injury because of his brother Issachar, who basically said, hey man, that's just not a good idea. Don't do that. Because of his nature of being inquisitive, his older brother said, that's just not good. I have a story. When I was younger, I'm the youngest in my family. I have 3 siblings. My sister's the oldest. It was her birthday yesterday, so happy birthday, sister. When I was younger, I remember I had this idea one time. I was going to make a parachute out of a paper bag. And I crafted this device, and it was perfect. Now I just needed to test it. And I had this idea that jumping off the roof of the house and floating to safety. And as I was getting ready to leave the house, my sister, who's the oldest, saw me and she said, what is that and where are you going? And without question, I stand here today with 2 legs and able to speak because of the wisdom of my sister. I needed her in my life. I needed her. So back to Paul's words here. We don't need to make always everybody like us. In other words, he says here, so the eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you. I don't need you, hand. Or he can't say to the hand, can't you just be an eye for a little while? Please? Because you're driving me nuts. Can you not just be an eye like me for a little while? Because you just drive me insane. So he can't say that because we need each other. Verse 23, in those parts of the body that we think to be less honorable, we clothe with the greatest honor. And our unpresentable parts have a better presentation, but our presentable parts have no need of clothing. Instead, God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the less honorable, so that there would be no division in the body, but that the members, listen to this, would have the same concern for each other. So if one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. If one member is honored, all the members rejoice with it. We have to look at this as I need you, you need me. I need you, you need me. Zebulun has to look at Issachar, I need you. And Issachar has to look at Zebulun and said, I need you. Even though you drive me out of my mind, I need you. Coming back to these two brothers, in 1 Chronicles, looking on into their future as their people. In 1 Chronicles chapter 12, we read a story of David as he's coming to take over the kingdom. Saul has passed, and David is coming to Hebron to take over the kingdom. And it lists the tribes of Israel that come up and send fighting men to assist David in this transition. And in verse 32 it says this, from the Issacharites who understood the times and knew what Israel should do, 200 chiefs with all their relatives under their command. This is how many came up. And verse 33, from Zebulun, 50,000 who could serve in the army, trained for battle with all kinds of weapons of war, with one purpose, to help David. So we see in this, the sons of Issachar had wisdom, understanding. They knew what to do. They knew strategy. And the sons of Zebulun, probably because they traveled a lot, had gathered all kinds of knowledge on different types of weapons and training on how to use different types of weapons of war. So their characters both brought a unique gift to David as he's beginning to set up his kingdom. David needed both of them. In fact, he needed all the brothers. But their uniqueness brought something to him as he transitioned. So, as we close tonight, I just want to ask a couple questions. The worship team can come as we kind of move through this. Do you know yourself? We know ourselves? Do you know yourself? Do you know your strengths? Do you know your weaknesses? Because Jacob thought it important to make sure that his sons knew themselves. Are you trying to become something that you were not intended to be? I said recently in the staff devotion, be careful with this idea of not believing in who God made you to be or the giftings that He gave you. Because in essence, what we can be saying to God is, God, what you gave me is worthless. So be careful, because God doesn't give worthless things. So don't get caught up. Know yourself. And if you don't feel like you know yourself well, ask your Father. Ask your Father. He created you. He can tell you who you are, who He desires for you to be. You can feel free to ask Him. Knowing our strengths can allow us to be a greater help to those around us. Knowing our weaknesses can help us know where we are vulnerable and where we need help. So these are good questions to ask and for us to think about. Because the Father sees and He knows. Second question. Do you have relationships that have been strained due to differences? A marriage relationship, a parent-child relationship, a friendship. Again, you have to know that these two brothers at some point in their lives were angry as all get out with each other. And it happens. We're different. And that causes tension at times. And I encourage you that if you have relationships in your life that have been strained or in a difficult place because of differences, I encourage you to ask the Father to help you see where there might be value in those differences. I encourage you to seek help with counsel, wise counsel and good counsel. We have the Anchor of Hope Counseling Center. Wonderful people that can give you good insight. I will tell you now, it's not always good to go to your friends. Why? Because, Catherine backed me up on this, I think we tend to surround ourselves with people that think like us. And they'll tend to probably see things the way we see it. And sometimes it's good to go to another party and seek wise counsel and understanding. Maybe I'm not seeing this correctly, and I need someone else to show me that. Are we trying to make someone else more like us? Are we saying to the hand, please just be an eye? Please. I would encourage you to pray for the Lord to give you insight in this area, if that's happening. I remember my wife's aunt one time shared with us that her and her husband had prayed for their children. And the prayer that they prayed was that anything that they had inadvertently or not intentionally put onto their children that was not something that God desired for them, that God would give them wisdom and help them to realize that, and that burden would be removed from their children, that their children wouldn't be burdened with anything that wasn't what God desired for them. And I encourage us, again, if we are placing things on people because we want them to be more like us, ask God for wisdom. God, give me wisdom. If this person needs to change, then that's you in their life changing. But if I need to understand them differently or see them differently, give me wisdom. And finally, the question is, are you using your unique gifts for kingdom purposes? As we read, we need each other. We need all parts of the body to be fully capable. We need everybody. We need every gift that God created for us to do the work of His kingdom. I say to our staff, we can't replace people. We can fill roles, but you can't replace people. Why? Because people will do things uniquely who they are. There will never be another person that will come and do something exactly like that person. They can do a role, but you are uniquely you. God has uniquely gifted you to do things the way He designed you to do it, and His kingdom needs you active with those things. So I encourage you and I challenge you with those things tonight, that just let those questions kind of resonate with you as you go home tonight, and ask the Lord, and if any of these things are true, that the Lord would just challenge us this week and work through us, that these words and the blessing of a father to his sons, and as Pastor Chad so well said, it's not always a blessing of you're going to be wealthy and it's sometimes a blessing of insight as to who we are, that blessing of the Father would become real in us, and we would apply these things in our life. Father, tonight we thank you. We thank you that you've made each one of us unique and that you form us collectively into your body. Father, I pray that you would help us to value each other, that we would have the same concern for one another that you have for us. Father, I pray that you would grow us in our strengths and help us to identify our weaknesses, that we might be the body that you desire us to be, the people that you desire us to be, and that we might bring glory to your name. And we ask it in the mighty and precious name of Yeshua.